Hi everybody, Karen Olari here. So I thought it would be kind of fun today to do a critique of one of my own paintings. Um, I've been looking at this one. It's been hanging in my bathroom for quite a number of years, and there's some things I like about it and some things that just didn't work, which is, it's still hanging in my bathroom. So that's one reason, it didn't really work. But so I wanted to take a look at it, and I really recommend this for yourself after you've been painting a few years and as you learn more things. Sometimes we get to feeling like we've gotten to a certain plateau and we're not really learning new things. And going back to some of your older paintings and taking a look at them with fresh eyes and with the knowledge that you have uh, gotten in between the time you painted it and the time that you are now can be really helpful, both in maybe reworking the painting but just also in reinforcing in yourself that you are learning and you are growing. So that's something I wanted to do for me at this point, because it's real easy to start feeling like, oh, I'm not going anywhere after a certain period of time. So I was pretty happy with this painting when I painted it. It's fairly small. It's either an 8 by 10 or a 9 by 12, and in acrylics, of course. And at the time I was painting it, I was really into experimenting with textures with my brush. It's when I had just first started really learning to use a small round bristle brush in the way I like to learn it. If you've watched any of my videos, you've probably seen the way I use the small round bristle brush. But I I was also still struggling with the concept of values. I was really focused in on, light against dark, dark against light. So, I saw this background range of hills as being a way to have the dark against the lighter branches. The light source was over here in the reference image, which caused this fade out or bleed out of the sky and the hills over here. Um, and I was still really focused on painting just what I saw and not taking very many risks um, in terms of artistic license or changing things up, getting away from that reference photo and just looking at the painting for itself and deciding whether or not it works and whether or not it's leading the eye in the right way, whether it's telling the story that you want to tell. So for me, the story of this painting was really this really gnarly, interesting tree with its few end of autumn kind of leaves still on it, and the pattern that formed, and the way that it's turned out in the image. Um, I think I'm. Let me. In the image, I'm not really getting the focus as much on this tree, and in thinking about it, this is what I'm coming up with. First of all, what catches your eye is this bright blue that I have in the water, and I did like that at the time because I was, again, not so much clued into value as I was to color, and the blue of the water against the oranges of the foliage I felt made a strong statement visually, but it's not really coming across that way. The blue is really overwhelming the focal point of the tree, and it's looking very excuse me, sort of fake. It doesn't look real. So there's something wrong with that blue. It's a little too bright. It's a little too in your face. The second thing has to do with the composition, in the sense that this area right here, this shape that's created, is awkward, and it draws the eye in a way that it's not helping the composition. So you have the dark against the light. So whenever you have a strong dark light contrast, your eye is going to go directly there. It also has these strong lines that bring your eye out of the painting, and they're not stopped in any way. And so they serve to, as you just look at this, just glance at this image, you have a tendency to your eye to go straight over here to this area, which is not anything about the painting that I wanted to focus on. It's not anything about the story I was telling. I think as I looked at the image, I was caught by the way the light was playing on that back field, and I thought that looked interesting. But that comes back to editing. It is interesting, but it's not interesting in this image, and it's taking up proportionally way too much of your visual interest, you know. So I need to deal with that. Also, this big bank of trees. Again, I wasn't focused on using value as a way to create distance much. I lightened the value over here and warmed it up because of the sunlight, but this is really dark and it's staying forward. It's not settling back into the distance. I like the muted colors, but if instead of thinking of light against dark, which is what I was trying to do with these leaves to make these leaves pop, if instead I thought of cool against warm, so this whole color and value of this background isn't right. I need to adjust that. It needs to go lighter to go into the distance. It needs to have some variation from the furthest back into the closer areas, from lighter to more neutral up here, or darker up here, from more neutral to more chromatic. There needs to be a variation so this isn't just a big flat area. The other awkward thing, so we've got value wrong back here, and then we've got these three trees, which is the way that the reference photo was. They stopped there, but it's not helping my story. These trees, were I to do it now, I would move them back over, create a stop for the eye here, and then I could have some interest back here with that little bit of open field back there, but my eye wouldn't be awkwardly running off the page here, if that makes any sense to you. It would also help with this feeling of imbalance. Everything feels kind of crowded over here and then off over here. So that whole placement of that triplet, of that trio of trees there, is just off to me. Again, I talked about the color of this being both too blue and not varied enough. I've gotten it a little darker up here in the foreground, and I've got some reflections here, which is nice, but overall the color's just wrong. It's the same with the grasses, the dried grasses that are down here in the water. They're the same color, the same value, the same chroma as what I've got going on in the foreground, and that never works. This is a pretty high bank. It's a pretty long ways down to that river, as you can tell by the distance of the trees and how small the trees are. So I really need to see a change in value and chroma between these grasses here in the foreground leaves and the tree and the foreground grasses. So those need to be neutralized out. I need to see a variation from foreground to distance there as well. Darker, more chromatic, into lighter, more neutral. I need to see that shift. Those shifts in value, color, and chroma are very important in giving yourself a sense of distance. I did it a little bit with these trees, but the same concept. As they go into this distance here, they're going to change. So I got that light source coming through. It's shining through the trees. It's really kind of backlit here. Because I made this so light right here, it looks like the light source is right here, when in reality the light source would have been out over here, because it's shining this direction, creating shadows this direction. And it is, more shining on the tree as opposed to this being backlit. If the sun was back here, these would be more backlit. Anyway, so I played that up a little bit too much, I think, that light there. And again, I needed to have the highest value contrast, the brightest chroma and the most detail in this tree, which is what I really wanted to bring in as the focal point. So those are my ideas for my critique for this painting. I'm going to work a little while in Photoshop here and see if I can make some of those changes here in Photoshop, and if I like them, I might even go back and change the painting itself. Okay, well, we'll talk to you soon. All right, here we are working in Photoshop to make those adjustments that I talked about. Don't really want to do a Photoshop tutorial here, but I just want to talk you through the ideas of why I'm making the changes that I am. I've sped this up about 3 times, I think, so we can get through this a little faster. But basically, when you use Photoshop like this, I can sample the colors that are there and then adjust them into something that more I'm looking for. So the first thing I'm doing is working on this back range of trees here to try to find a lighter value and sort of a more bluish, purplish range of colors, and then also to find a gradation of color from the back to the front, so it doesn't just look like one flat space, but it has some depth to it. Here I've chosen a blue, and I'm going back into the sky and playing with the concept of having the sky be more blue. The way that I have the river reflecting that blue sky so strongly didn't make a lot of sense with the fact that the sky itself had a lot of clouds in it. It only had one very small area that was actually blue, so that didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I've gone back in and I'm playing with different colors and different values of blues, deciding whether I want a warmer blue or a cooler blue and how chromatic I want that color. So you can see I can go and choose on that chooser, and here I've chosen more of a blue-green to see if I like that color, but I didn't, so I've come back to a warmer blue there. As you can see, it's changing over from that sort of blue-green to the warmer blue. I'm thinking more, the whole overall color contrast was that blue and orange. So those are complementary colors, and that creates interest. But there's also a lot of yellow in the leaves, and the complementary color to yellow is purple. So if I get a color that's more in between, a blue that's a little more leaning towards purple than towards green, as I have here, I think it would be more helpful. So what I did there was I had taken that same sky color and on a very taken out a lot of the opacity of the color, so it wasn't 100% strong. It was kind of transparent. And first I washed over the whole area, but I didn't like that, so instead I came back and I just took that whole area of the water down from that blue-green to a slightly warmer and more neutral blue, and to start that softening process. And I think you can see already that it's a little more neutral than it was. Okay, so I'm also adding some dark here. Like I was mentioning before, I wanted to see more of a variation in color and value in the river itself, so that there's a transition from foreground into the distance, as well as foreground towards us to across the bank. So we have all these variations in light situations, and I wanted to bring some of that in. So here I'm moving that range of that little trio of trees over to the side. So I'm getting rid of that area that was open and it was blocking our view there. It wasn't blocking our view, it was drawing our eye to that open square on the left-hand side. And you can see that in the little square that I've left over to the side. That's the original painting, so that you can watch the transition as we go through this. So once I moved those trees over, now I'm having to recreate the background behind them. So now I have that open space more in the middle of the painting, and the trees are blocking that our eye from going off of the page there, and our eye is drawn more into the center and into the tree area. Now I'm working a little more on finding the colors that I want to use in that background hill. So I've got some muted greens that I'm putting in, some that are slightly more blue, slightly more green. There in the same way as having lines going off the page, it's nice to have, when you have those background mountains, not have a line going up and then downward off the page to the left. Instead, I brought that range of mountains up so that our eye goes downward in towards the center instead of out off like a little slide, taking our eye right off of the painting. You can see how I've got some more neutral purples in the back, so I'm thinking about that purple, yellow, purple gold contrast that's nice in there, and you can see that I've got a lighter value moving into a little darker purple value, and then I'm moving into the more greens, but the colors are really value-wise pretty close. It's a pretty subtle transition there in values and in colors. So as I use this program, there I'm switched back and forth real quick so that I could see the difference, but you can follow it over on the right there too and see the difference in value already between the way I did have that dark background and the way it is now. So now I'm sampling up some of this dark brownish color, and if you noticed, the dark there that I had under those trees was the same value as the darks in the foreground. It was just as dark, and it's a very important concept as you create distance to make sure your darks in the mid or the background are all lighter than the darks that you have in the foreground, and that will maintain your sense of distance. And I hadn't done that at all. I just had the darks that were clear across the river just as dark as my darks in the foreground. So I went in and I worked with that, just sampled that color and then took it down in value so it wasn't as dark. So I've also added sort of a shadow color to those golds to create a sort of a shadow against those hills in the background, trying to create a smooth and blended transition from the field to those back trees. You don't want a harsh line back there. You want everything to be very blended and soft, no hard edges. And I do that in Photoshop by using this smudge tool, so I can just go in and smudge out the lines and kind of pull the color here and there to make it softer and not as strong. So you can see I created also, though because of the way the light's coming, a lot of that whole background area is in shadow, but the light is hitting onto the field like that. So I took a color that was a little brighter, a little more chromatic, and threw that some there into that field to create some interest. It's important when you have those big areas of field or any kind of an element, again, you want transitions of color and value and chroma. You don't want that entire field to be all the same value, color, and chroma, because it's going, there's probably a mile between the riverbank and those back trees. There's a long distance there. Well, maybe not a mile, but I'm really bad at distances. Point being, you need those subtle changes. Okay, so here I'm coming in with a light grayish purple that's not very opaque. It's kind of translucent, and this would be the equivalent in painting of using a wash. So paint that's very watered down, or using medium to thin it out so it's more transparent, and then just you can see how I was able to just knock that whole area back all at once by using that wash. Now I'm coming back in and adding some slightly darker areas to that, so I have a slightly bigger value range. I'm also being sure as I go along to create the reflections in the water of those grasses that are down there as I'm going. Generally, your reflections are going to be a little darker, a little more neutral, so I'm kind of adjusting as I go. I can also adjust as I smudge. So again, using a dark, but I'm not going as dark as the darks in the foreground. I'm adjusting so that that looks more distant, and you can already see by comparing it to the image next to it there, the original, how much more that whole river area is now obviously back from the forward bank instead of that being sort of a confusing transition there. Working a little bit on adding some darks. And another concept in painting that you want to be careful with is when you go darker or you go lighter, you're also changing colors somewhat. So it's not just a value shift, it's a color shift. So I'm going slightly bluer on the shadows, and I'm going slightly warmer, more yellow on the highlights. Adding back a few more highlights, so you can tell that as I go here, I'm literally bringing that area a little closer to us just by using some slightly lighter lights and slightly darker darks. I can adjust how far into the distance that seems like it is. I'm going to want to keep those grasses that are in the river to the right or back more soft, and then just add a few more highlights to those on the right hand side because they're closer to us. So in thinking about all those things, now I took a blue color, so basically that lighter color, which is similar to the sky color, to add a little bit of water ripples, so you can tell where the bank is, you can tell where there's some movement in the water, and you can tell that it's a river. And I go back in with my smudge tool to smudge them out. And this is just the same when you're painting as going in and laying down those paint strokes and then immediately rinsing your brush, patting it dry, and brushing them out, blending them out a little bit. Of course, I'm talking about using acrylic paint. It's completely different if you're using oils, but that's the technique when you're using oils to get the equivalent of what I'm doing here in Photoshop, which is smudging that line. I got rid of my background layer there and realized that I had on my foreground layer that I'm working on, I was missing some areas, so I'm just taking a little time here to recreate those areas that were blank from before. Again, just sampling colors and then drawing them in with the brush tool, and then coming back and smudging them out so that I get a little more distance. Again, the smudging, I had a lot of brush strokes in the original painting. You could visibly see a lot of brush strokes, both in the far background and in the cross the bank areas. And that's another aspect beyond chroma and value and color when you're working with creating distance is edges. So edges would be the edges of your brush strokes. Is it a soft blended brush stroke, or is it a crisp edged brush stroke? So you want to keep all those background areas blended and soft, no hard edges, and then as you move forward in your painting you can have some more hard edges. If I leave in the background a crisp edge like that, it will mess with the distance and it'll automatically pop forward and you won't have that same sense of distance. And I think you can kind of compare the one on the right hand side that has the more crisp edges to, as I'm going along here and softening all those edges, that whole area is staying in the background and giving my painting more depth, which is what really helps you feel like you can just walk right into the painting. And I really enjoy that anyway. So I continued to smudge out those little blue, light blue. Remember, they're not white. The little ripples on the river aren't pure white, but they're blue color, more like the sky. So I continued to smudge those out. Excuse me, allergies. So Now I'm adding back some shadow side to those trees, adjusting some shadow in there and pulling that shadow into the reflection as well. You'll notice that that's a bluer color. It's not real dark. It's just a little bit bluer and darker, and staying in the neutral color range. Doing a little more smudging there, deciding how much of that field I want open, and it's kind of bothering me there how much I'm thinking about where I want to put some more trees, and more, just kind of fill that space in a little more randomly so it's not quite so open back there. So I just added, starting with some dark, which is just how I would do it if I was painting. I would start with my dark values and I would add those lighter values, remembering the direction of the light source. It's coming from the right, so the right sides of those trees are going to be lighter than the left sides, and I'm going on to use some smudging there. Adding back in some more darks, just adjusting those dark and light values. You can see if I go back and actually do this with the painting, which I might well do because it's just been bugging me for so long. It's almost like recreating the painting. I'm making the overall image is the same, but I would really be coming in with a whole new layer of values and colors. But I like to do this in Photoshop. There you can see the difference real clearly of the distance that I now have versus the way it was all kind of more flat before. I was only using size basically as my indicator of distance in the original painting. I wasn't using value or chroma or edges. So again, just doing some smudging of those colors, creating some forms. Probably don't need to go to this distance to get an idea for myself, but I really enjoy doing this, and then I can come back and use this photoshopped picture later when I'm painting, and it helps me. So as I looked at that background and I compared it, the more I compared it, the more I felt it was still too dark. So what I did was I came in and I sampled the same colors I was using, and then I just moved them up one shade in value. About the same chroma, but just one value shade lighter, because I felt like that distance was still a little too close. I just needed that subtle change, I felt. And I think you'll be able to see here that just that little distance, that little more, a couple shades lighter in value, maintaining the same chroma, but just going just a little bit lighter. And again, I've got basically two layers of purplish neutral mountains, and then into the neutralized greens, a more yellow green, a more blue green, slightly lighter and darker. So those subtle color shifts that create that distance. Now you can see that the foreground trees have a distinctively more darks and more lights and more chroma. And before, the darks were getting really close to the darks in those crossbank trees. So the distant darks were a little too dark. They were matching those trees that are across the bank, and they have to be lighter because they're significantly further in the distance. So here I'm just playing with the shapes of those background hills. You want to be sure not to mimic the shapes, but change the highs and lows so each layer coming forward doesn't have the same highs and the same lows, but they offset each other. So now as I thought about it, I felt that the background also needed some of those autumn colors in the background. So it would have some of those trees similar to the one in the foreground in those backgrounds as well. And that really gives you the opportunity to show distance because it's the same element further away. So it'll be brightest in the foreground, mid-tones in that mid-ground area, and then lightest and most neutral in the background. And that emphasizes or reinforces, again, that distance. And then coming into these grasses, I wanted to add some even lighter and slightly more chromatic areas. You can see the difference there, but you can also keep track over on the right-hand side. Okay, now I'm starting to work on the tree itself, and this is a little harder to, as I'm painting this, and I would move to a bigger brush, and I would be really using my brush strokes here to create the shapes of these leaves without making them really tight. Instead, I would use a larger brush and create quick brush strokes, which is a little harder to do in Facebook, but in Photoshop, but what I'm focusing on instead is the colors and the values. So I'm using more chromatic color, brighter colors. These are combinations of the oranges, golds that were there, and I'm bringing some of those same colors into the grasses in the foreground. I'm not sure what was in the reference photo in that foreground. It wasn't really obvious if that was just rocks but whatever it was, I'm making it more into grasses in this version. And now you can really distinctly see this is the edge of the bank, and then on the other side of it we have a drop down to the river. Whereas in the original, it was really ambiguous where the hill stopped and whether it was going downhill, what was going on there. But by overlapping these grasses onto the more neutral background, you can really see where the foreground stops and the midground starts. Taking that warm brown, dark neutral brown color, and I've really gone with a very reddish brown here versus the more kind of bluish brown that was in the original. I like to keep my darkest darks towards the warm side. I think it just adds more richness and warmth to the image. So I'm putting in, emphasizing, and even making more distinct the gnarliness, the movement, the curves to the trunk of the tree. In other words, it was a little bit straight coming up in the original image, and instead I'm giving that branch and those trunks and the branches more twists and turns because they are my focal point, and it makes them more interesting that way. So again, if I were doing my painting here, I would be using a small liner brush to make these little tiny twigs coming off of the branches. And notice I moved to a excuse me, lighter color, lighter in value, and slightly shifted to warmer when I get to these smaller branches. So the smaller the little twigs, the lighter they're going to appear, because of course you've got more light around them. If you make those little tiny twigs too dark, then it comes across as unnatural. Instead, you want to shift to that lighter color. And now I'm going back in with my smudge tool to just blend out those edges again. You know, when you're making a tree trunk like this, you just want to keep your brush strokes loose, add a lot of different variety of slight shifts in color and value, and that's what gives you the texture. In other words, don't use just all one color or two colors to make that trunk, but keep mixing in some other colors with the trunk colors. A little more blue, a little more red, a little lighter, a little more gray, and just those slight shifts that you put in here and there are going to add interest and texture to your trunks and your branches. Again, I moved also into some sort of redder browns, a little deeper in color, warmer in chroma. And you also notice that I'm making my brush strokes here larger. In other words, in the original, the the strokes that I used for the leaves on the trees were almost as small as the strokes I used in the background. So there wasn't a real size difference. And instead, when I do this when I'm painting, I'm going to use bigger brush strokes and larger sizes in the foreground because obviously they're further in the foreground. And I'd be leaving those edges that I talked about before. So I would be leaving a little more crispness to the edges, blending out some, combining shapes. You know, this tree is actually getting a little more polka dotted looking than I normally like. I would really try to vary the shape, so have areas where there's a few leaves together and then areas where there's just one or two leaves, tinier leaves versus bigger leaves, variation in size and shape and value. And those variations are what create what we call detail. It's not necessarily going in with tiny brushes and trying to recreate what we see in the photo, but it's using more variations in edges, colors, values, shapes, just to create what comes across as detail. That gives you a more painterly effect than trying to really like draw in individual leaf shapes. Again, I'm making this into grasses, so I'm adding all those colors. Some of it would be fallen leaves and some of it would be grasses, and I'm just using really random shapes, which is exactly what I'd be doing if I was using a paintbrush. I'd be using a combination of a bigger brush and then that liner brush to flick in grass shapes, being sure to vary the direction of my strokes and vary the colors and values that I'm using. Here I'm using the smudge tool again to draw those colors into each other and to smudge them out here and there and to lighten up those grass shapes so they don't look quite so thick and heavy. Again, you'd be doing this using a small liner brush and held very loosely to get that sense of tangled mess of old dried leaves and whatnot. I've decided I wanted to add a little bit of green in here too. So I sampled the green in the background, and then I went a little lighter and a little more chromatic. And then added a little darker and more chromatic, so that you see that step back in color and value in the greens as well. Because there would probably be a little bit of green grasses and bushes and whatnot left in the foreground as well. Since it's on the far side of the river, you'd also see it on this side of the river as well. You can really start to see the change now between the image on the right and where we've come now with these with the image that we're working on. You can really see the distance, and that tree now is the focal point. It's definitely the focal point of the image, and our eye comes in and is drawn in to that area of foliage from all of the areas of the painting. Here I am taking another Photoshop tool, which is just going to darken it. It's called the burn tool, and I'm darkening that right corner a little more overall because that's going to be more in shadow. So I'm just creating that more of a shadow area, and now I'm using the saturate tool, and I'm just bringing up some of the colors and making them even a little more saturated. So I would, of course, have to do this in my paints by actually mixing some new colors. But as I'm doing it here, I can see where I want to go, and that's going to save me time when I'm painting. Here I'm just playing and adjusting some of these edges in the tree, making it feel more blended, and until I can step back, squint my eyes, and really get an overall feel of what I'm doing. I don't want to see any distinct things that draw my eyes here. I just want a sense of random dry grasses and weeds and whatnot in the foreground. Well, there you are. There is the comparison of the old one, new version, versus the old version. And here I'm going to show you in a second also the black and white version so that you can really see the value change. Do you see how I now have the much stronger values in the front and how that was different from the ones in the back? So I hope you enjoyed that little adjustment tutorial, and you can also get these for yourself. So be sure to follow the link in the description below if you'd like to have your own personal critique. It's available to you, and be sure to like my video and to subscribe to the channel for more acrylic painting tutorials. Thanks for joining me today.